And where are you calling in from today, Tom?
I'm calling in from northern Utah, from the just under the Utah-Idaho border. So I'm right near Utah State University. So I'm just calling in from my house, actually, but it seems to be an okay connection.
Yep, coming in loud and clear.
Is this any better?
I can hear you. It's still kind of soft, but I can actually adjust it up on my end, I guess.
How about this?
That's good. That's
okay.
Really good.
All right, so I'm going to do
I'm going to do a quick intro, but I'm mainly going to get out of the way. So I want to welcome everybody to the last session of our symposium on new media and learning, and I'm really excited to have Tom Caswell and Marion Jensen, both from Utah State University, to tell us about a really fascinating project they've done to use Twitter to do historical reenactments. It's a great idea using a popular social networking platform. And it was a pleasure to meet Tom a couple months ago when we had that meeting in Barcelona and getting to know his work. And he's been both Tom and Marion have been part of a lot of the open courseware initiatives that have gone on out of Utah. And they're obviously doing a lot of innovative work here with this project. And with that, I'm going to let you guys tell us a little bit about TwHistory.
All right. Just quickly, again, by way of introduction, my name is Marion Jensen and Tom Caswell. We met at Utah State, both working on Utah State's open courseware project. And as things kind of dried up there, we both went our separate ways. But before we did, we got to thinking about this whole Twitter history idea and have since kept in touch and have kept working on that. So the basic idea is using Twitter to create historical reenactments. Usually when you think of a historical reenactment, you think of people dressing up in costumes and going and reenacting a particular battle. Usually these reenactments don't last more than a couple of hours, sometimes a couple of days, but that's it. And just as we got to know Twitter, we started to think, there's some interesting things that Twitter affords that we could do these virtual reenactments. But before we dive in too deep, we just kind of wanted to briefly all get on the same page with what Twitter is and then how we're using it. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom to talk a little bit about Twitter.
Okay, so I don't think we're going to have to spend very much time explaining Twitter to this crowd, but I think there are a few things that we want to just highlight as we talk about why we chose Twitter for the TwHistory project. So of course, Twitter is a status updating service, and for most people use Twitter to answer the question, what's happening. So they, in 140 characters or less, they share the sometimes mundane events of their life. I'm sitting here petting my cat or whatever, and so we decided to use that vehicle because it allows for updates to happen in real time, and it also allows access to a large audience. Twitter's currently, well, these numbers are a little bit old, but as of late last year, Twitter is being used by approximately 20 million visitors every month. Approximately 19% of American internet users in the United States, I should say, are also using Twitter. So it's a substantial audience, and so these Twitter messages or tweets we're able to access a large number of people. And one of the things that makes Twitter a little bit different than something like Facebook, perhaps, is where you have in Facebook you have the friending concept, where you are kind of sharing random facts with specific people. Twitter, on the other hand, is a vehicle where we can actually share specific information with random people. So it's a little bit different, and that's why we chose it. So now turn it back to Marion just to talk a little bit about our idea.
Yeah, and I think that last thing that Tom talked about is critical. You know, when you talk about Facebook, again, I'm sharing random information with specific people, and the reason that information is interesting to me is because it's those specific people. So if my sister-in-law finds out she's expecting, I'm interested in that because now I'm going to be an uncle. It relates to me because of her relationship with me. It's not so much that I'm interested in the pregnancy topic, but the fact that she has become pregnant, now it relates to me. Twitter, on the other hand, I can go out and find specific things and talk with completely random strangers, but we're joined because of that piece of information. So, kind of the way that this happened is, I think I experienced Twitter like many people. The first time I tried it out, I thought, this is the most worthless thing ever. I just couldn't see any use, because I followed a few people and I heard things like Tom mentioned, you know, I'm petting my cat, or, you know, this yogurt is good. That wasn't real fascinating for me. And I came back to Twitter a little bit later and still thought it was the worst. Still thought it just, you know, I couldn't see any value in it. But then I had an experience where I attended a conference, and they said, whoever's attending this conference, if you're going to tweet to this specific tag. And that's where the light bulbs went off, because I could follow what other people were doing at that conference, but then not just that conference that I was attending, but I followed another conference, and I was introduced to all of these random people who were interested in the same thing. And as I followed these conference attendees, it was kind of interesting because, you know, I'd hear about all of this stuff. It was kind of the same things, and then suddenly everybody would stop tweeting. And I thought, well, what just happened? And then realized that it was the coffee break. Everybody was up getting their coffee and talking to each other. And then, you know, once again, the tweeting started to pick up. So I kind of felt a sense of presence, that even though I wasn't at the conference, I felt like I was kind of there. So the first thing that went off, I see someone posted a link to the comic. That's the exact one I was talking about, just kind of the life cycle of this thing's useless to now I can't stop. Anyways, I attended saw the conference and kind of saw the value of kind of being there. And the first thing that went off in my head, I've written a couple of novels and gotten them published, and the writer side of me thought, hey, you could write a book and tweet the whole thing. You just have all of your cast of characters who are tweeting stuff, and you'd get a sense of experiencing this book. And the second thought that went off in my head was, that's far too much work. It would take a lot of work to pull something like that together. But shortly after, I thought, you know, a lot of the work's already been done if you look at history. So we have journals, we have letters, and a lot of times people aren't introduced to the journals or letters. They're introduced to history through a movie or through a book that's written by a historian who went through all of those journals and letters. But I thought, what if you took those journals and letters and tweeted the content that was in that? And that's where things, you know, I started talking to Tom, and things got interesting. So the first thing we did, you can see on the slide, is in the spring of 2009, I went over to the Utah State Library and found 15 books that were compilations of journals and letters from Civil War soldiers who were at the Battle of Gettysburg. And just kind of as a proof of concept, we started about 2 months early, so just before the Battle of Chancellorsville, and we just started tweeting. We set up 15 Twitter accounts and started tweeting what happened to these individuals. And on some days, you know, not much happened. It was just kind of a report on the weather and, you know, what they had for breakfast and things like that. But we would tweet at the appropriate times. So if they says, you know, I had beans for breakfast, in the morning we would tweet, I'm eating beans for breakfast. So if you just followed one of these people, probably not very interesting. But as you followed the whole group, all 15 of them, it was almost like listening to an orchestra. You got a sense of what was going on, and it almost felt like you were there. And that's where things for me got really exciting, because it was like you know, with history, you almost always experience it outside of real time. So you watch the Battle of Gettysburg movie, you experience all of Gettysburg in 3 days. If you read Killer Angels, you know, you read it over the course of maybe a month, maybe a couple of weeks, but it's always outside of real time. But with this, it was experiencing history as it happened. So from Chancellorsville to Gettysburg was about 2 months. That's how long it took for the followers of this project to experience Gettysburg. It was kind of a neat experience, and you know, it was kind of neat for the followers to get a feel for history. But I learned stuff reading those original source documents and preparing it into tweets, and that's kind of where the instructional technology side of both of us say, hey, there's a great learning potential here. So that's kind of that's kind of the big idea and the experience that we had with Gettysburg. Tom's going to talk a little bit more about kind of the learning potential to this, not just for those that follow, but also for those that create, and some of the benefits that these types of reenactments can give.
Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And just to mention a couple of the recent projects, Marion shared a little bit about the Battle of Gettysburg, and that really was the first experience we had with using Twitter, creating these accounts, representing these historical figures, and then carrying out a reenactment using that space to give the different perspectives of those from each of those historical figures. And we really based as much as we could. We based all the information from the journals and other primary sources, which is another interesting side to this. There's a lot of interest in using these primary sources that are now available online, a lot of them. So that's another angle on this. But then what happened from that point was interesting, and this, I guess, is a testament to some of the viral nature of Twitter. But a Cold War history teacher in Missouri picked up on this idea, and I guess decided at that point that she wanted to see if she could set up her own reenactment. So at that point we had set up the website TwHistory.org, and we were putting together just some ideas on how we could share this with others. But Carla, the Cold War history teacher, decided that she contacted us directly and asked us what the different ingredients were to make something like this happen. So that motivated us to put together a kind of a recipe, and so we contacted her back and let her know what we had done, and then she was able to pull together with her students this time, rather than this being done by adults. She had her high school students put together, each of them working in small groups. She had them represent, each small group represented a single character in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So at this point, it got really interesting, because here were high school students getting really excited about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I have to say, they weren't always in character. We had some interesting. We saw some tweets come across that where Khrushchev, I think, told JFK "Booyah" and things like that, and so we understand that in some cases that there was some license taken, and this TwHistory idea, it will be used with different amounts of rigor depending on what group is implementing it. But it was exciting to see the students getting excited about doing a historical reenactment and actually digging into Library of Congress sources. And at one point, even the pilot from the spy plane, the U.S. spy plane that flew over Cuba, actually tweets a link to the actual spy imagery, the photograph of the missile installations in Cuba. So again, you have some very creative uses of the social media, and it's not strictly just 140 characters, but they were finding that they could actually stretch that and link out to other images and other sources as part of their tweets. So so you had an interesting kind of a model forming, and I guess I should explain that part of this we actually had at the very beginning with the Battle of Gettysburg. Marion was feverishly posting tweets at all times of the day to try and represent the different characters who were in that reenactment, and then we very quickly, yeah, we very quickly realized that that we needed a better system. So we found there was a programmer who got involved with the project and volunteered to develop a kind of a timer mechanism where we could preload the tweets into the system, and it was called timed tweets, and it allowed us to have the different Twitter messages happening at the appropriate times, but without having to literally be at the computer all day long, ready to enter a specific tweet. So so perhaps something is lost by scheduling the tweets, but it certainly makes it a lot more manageable, and then there isn't the risk of forgetting or those kinds of things as well. So that was those were part of the ingredients that went into this kind of a recipe that we shared with Carla Fetterman, and she then implemented with her Cold War history class in fall of 2009. Next slide, please. So a quote that I wanted to pull out from a Confederate private that came from one of the journals that we used in the Battle of Gettysburg reenactment is by Louis Leon. Again, he's a Confederate private, and he said, "This diary was commenced for the fun of writing down my experience. I never thought for a moment that I would put it in print, but now that I am getting old and have read so many histories written by our officers, but have never seen in print a history written by a private." And not only was Louis Leon a private, but he was a Confederate private. So again, the idea here is that we can, using Twitter, we can actually represent perspectives, multiple perspectives on a particular historical event. Something that I think is important, and especially where you, in many cases, the saying is very true that history is written by the winners. But in this case, we can actually represent history from multiple perspectives, not just winners and losers, but perhaps privates or wives of privates, people who actually were involved with, who shared the historical moment, but perhaps from a completely different place. So so that actually helps us to look at the different historical perspectives, which I want to just share a little bit more about historical perspectives. Next slide, please. So to talk about some of the opportunities that that are afforded by the TwHistory model, certainly we can look at this from the perspective of the follower, those who actually follow the reenactment as it's happening, or we can look at it from the perspective of the actual participants, those who are creating the tweets. Now, the followers actually have the opportunity to experience the historical event in these bite-sized or micro updates, and they can experience them throughout their day. Actually, one aspect that is just emerging is that's very interesting to us is that we're finding that people are actually able to associate the historical events, the particular details of the historical events, with things they were actually doing at the time when they saw that particular Twitter update. And for a lot of people, that's actually helping them to remember the details of the historical events. It's interesting and something that perhaps should be investigated further. We're just seeing this this from our own experiences, but also we're finding that it's reported by others as well. The other thing that, and of course, well, before going on, I just want to mention that part of the idea that we're trying to achieve is to spread out the actual updates with the appropriate timing, so that it actually represents, to the best of our knowledge, when that particular update would have happened. So based on especially on the journals, we can approximate fairly closely when the different events occurred. Now, with something like the Battle of Gettysburg, we sometimes have to estimate, but with the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's much more precise, and we can actually send the Twitter updates down to the minute of when they would have occurred, so many years ago. Now, from the participant or the content creator's perspective, we can also, there are a lot of opportunities, and this is where I'm particularly interested as a former high school teacher. I think that there are opportunities here that, as was mentioned earlier in the keynote this morning, sometimes we see drastic differences between the performance of students when they're motivated to do something versus when there really isn't, they don't have much invested in it. And I think that in terms of connecting students to primary source documents, this is very true for TwHistory. As soon as they have a reason to research these primary sources, whether it be the Library of Congress website or something else, we find that they are, well, the preliminary feedback that we're getting from Carla Fetterman and her class is that they're very, very motivated, very engaged, and actually excited about history, which is something that sometimes doesn't happen, frankly. So we see a lot of opportunities here, and we're working just now to set up some research studies that will examine these ideas further, especially from the participant, the Twitter creator perspective, as people are representing these different historical figures. And with that, I'll turn it back to Marion.
Yeah, so just maybe to comment on a few things that have been brought up in the chat room. So the procedure for this is, you could assign the students, and probably the most amount of work for the instructors to find the original source documents, and that's something that we hope to help with on our site, is to say, here are 15 documents, and this is a Civil War package, or here's all the documents you'll need for the Cuban Missile Crisis, because then you can give those documents to the students. They can go back and start going through them and creating the tweets from there. And each student may have a character or a couple of characters, and they prepare the tweets, and then maybe they get together in groups. So, the McNamara and the JFK and the Robert Kennedy might get together and say, okay, we're all in this meeting, let's have some dialogue back and forth. Or as you finally compile everything into the main spreadsheet, you can see, oh, Khrushchev is, he's kind of mocking us and saying, booyah, maybe we have a reply. But, one of the interesting things that I learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of the students was playing I think it was the New York Times, so the newspaper, and you had all of this stuff going on. JFK and some of these characters were just frantic, and the newspaper was tweeting baseball scores, and I thought, what are they doing? How come they're not focusing on the event? And then I realized, oh yeah, it hasn't hit the presses yet. And a couple of days later, President Kennedy said, okay, how do we bring the press into this? And then suddenly the newspaper started tweeting, there's something going on in Cuba. And so to me, that was interesting and something that I didn't really think about. So if we could go to the next slide, these are just kind of the future plans that are coming up in the next few months. One of them is a pioneer trek. So this is the 1847 pioneer trek of a group of Mormon settlers that went from Nebraska to Salt Lake City. And I was able to find about 10 volunteers. We've done about 20 historical characters, and it's going to take place from the first week in April, so just a few weeks, to about the end of July. And we're kind of excited about that, one of our major reenactments for the year. We're also going to try to recreate the Battle of Gettysburg. That should be starting up towards the end of April. Excuse me. The beginning of that, of course, Gettysburg happened in July, but it started up with the Battle of Chancellorsville in April. We're also trying to decide if we have the bandwidth to do the Lewis and Clark expedition, and of course that takes place over several years. So we're just trying to decide. Of course, the money has not exactly flowed in from this. we're just doing this on our spare time. We enjoy doing it. So we're just trying to decide if, between all of the other things that we're working on, if we can pull that off. We have been seeking some funding because right now it's a little bit, it's not as easy as we would like. I guess I should put it that way. For an instructor to come, say someone who's teaching high school, they've got to come and use a tool off of one site and maybe a tool off of another site, and then have to hook up with us to post that. And right now, it's just not as easy as we would like it. So we'd like to have kind of a one-stop. So come here, find the documents that you want, create the characters right on our system, prepare the tweets in a spreadsheet or in our system, and then if you do it in a spreadsheet, upload it to the system. So kind of just everything is taking place right there. So like I mentioned, we're looking for some funding to do that. Our ultimate goal is that this would be a repository for historical simulations that have been done in the past. So maybe we have 10 or 15 versions of the Cuban Missile Crisis, some of them done by high school students, maybe some of them more strictly historical. And also a repository for documents where people can come and say, look, I want my class to participate. What's something that we can do? Maybe we have some documents from the Titanic or things like that people can find and use in their instruction.
And maybe can I jump in just for a sec?
Yes, you bet.
One thing that I think that came up in the chat and I think is good to point out is that the way we've set the Twitter reenactment up, it's open for anyone to follow, but we actually use a Twitter list that is then the Twitter list is available from the TwHistory website, and also just twitter.com/TwHistory. And those Twitter lists are controlled by us, and so that way we don't have the concern of course anyone can participate by following the reenactment, but we don't have the problem of someone perhaps tweeting something back that's inappropriate or something like that. So I think from a classroom teacher's perspective, and this is something that I think is important, and I saw this as a recurring concern with some of the other social media that I tried to implement in my classroom. But in this situation, it's quite safe, and the other nice thing is you don't actually have your students tweeting from personal accounts, but rather you've actually set up, as the teacher, you have set up these accounts in their behalf, and that way they're really tweeting for Abraham Lincoln or perhaps a different character, and so there isn't a concern of someone tracking them down or something like that. If they were stalking, they would only be stalking Abraham Lincoln.
And one of the things when we first started this was, I got several people that wrote to me and says, well, because it's a little bit of a pain, you have to follow all 14 or 15 of these characters. And someone said, why don't you just create a hashtag called #Gettysburg and just tweet to that? And that was the exact reason we chose not to go that route, because anybody can post to a #Gettysburg, but by having 15 different characters, only we could post to that particular list. So it kept out folks from coming in and adding things.
But at the same time, we should also just add that we've been pretty flexible about who joins these TwHistory reenactments. We've had volunteers, and we've used Google groups, and people have come in from different places. But for classroom reenactments, of course, the teacher has the say over who is going to be participating in the reenactment, and we list those side by side in our TwHistory reenactment directory. So all of the reenactments that we're listing are not necessarily done by us, but we're pretty open about others who want to take the same type of model and run with it.
All right, and then just kind of the final thing up there on the slide, the future development of TwHistory. The other thing we wanted to do was, of course, these reenactments are real time, but we certainly can think of an instance. For example, the Battle of Gettysburg happens 3 days in July. The 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. A little bit happens on the 1st. But if I'm teaching a class on the Civil War, I'm probably not teaching it during July. I'm probably teaching it in the fall or in the spring. So we wanted to, we're hoping to allow a system that would allow you to come and say, hey, I want to do the Battle of Gettysburg, but I want to do it, I want to spread it over 1 week in November, or I want to look at it in 3 weeks, during October, so that people can come and replay these when's most convenient for them. Because on the one hand, there's educational value to have students create it, but there's also educational value just to have students follow it. And we wanted to provide flexibility so that people could play these when it's conducive to their schedule. I think the next slide is just our questions slide. So I know we've had some good discussion going on in the chat room, but are there any questions for Tom and I?
I think we've put them all to sleep.
Oh no! Au contraire, I think it's really energetic. I think what's fascinating is it's such a beautifully simple idea that's just carried out well, and you guys have definitely demonstrated with the ones that are in the reenactment sections. I'm looking to see if any questions are rolling in. People are looking up things on Twitter.
It looks like
exciting Twitter idea.
It looks like there was a question, do we still use our original Twitter accounts? And we do, and this is something we didn't mention. I tweet under at Marion Jensen, and Tom is at Tom4Cam, and I think we've got that, we've got that up on the slide. But one thing we found, there's a little trick using Google. So my Google address is up there as well, marionjensen@gmail.com, but when I wanted to create a character for Abraham Lincoln, Twitter asks for an email, but if I use mine, it says this one's already in place. But if you use Gmail, you can do this cool little trick. So I entered in marionjensen+1@gmail.com. And that becomes a unique address, but anything sent to that address automatically redirects back to marionjensen@gmail.com. So I now have like Marion Jensen at +74 because I've created so many of these accounts. And all of those emails are directed back to me. And it can be plus anything. It can be plus spam. It can be plus, it can be anything. The only downside to that is anytime somebody follows a group, I get like 20 messages. So I know that somebody else has signed up to follow the Pioneer Trek. But you can make it manageable, and that little trick saves you and makes it easy to set up multiple accounts.
Right, and you also can turn off the messages if while you're setting up the Twitter account. If you set it up to not email you for every time people add you, then you can prevent all those emails coming back. But it's a nice trick. It's a nice workaround. But you can see that this is part of the reason why we're looking to secure some funding, because we can also if we could set up a more direct, kind of a more intentional system on TwHistory.org, then we wouldn't have to have kind of these workarounds like we do right now. But it certainly is doable at this point. It's something that's not very hard to implement, and we've actually put some instructions on the TwHistory.org site for how to do that.
Tony asked the question if this would work well for history museums, and that was actually one of the first people that contacted us was the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library, and we've talked to a few other museums that are interested in doing something like this, because you can do something like the Battle of Gettysburg or the Cuban Missile Crisis, but even just there's a local living history museum in local Utah that focuses on what farm life was like for 1917 farm families here in the area. So even just a reenactment that plays every 3 days that talks about what did the dad do, what did the mom do, what did the kids do out here on the farm, and it can be a great way that you spend 2 or 3 weeks developing something, and then you can just run that and play it. It becomes a nice way to kind of get your message out, a great tool for students to follow, and something interesting for just another way for them to kind of get their message out.
And certainly, I mean, reenactments are fantastic, but possibly some other motifs that you might do, whether to simulate I don't know, peace talks between Arab and Israelis, or maybe something futuristic scenario-wise.
Yeah, in fact, one of the ones, kind of my dream one to do would be the Continental Congress, or even just the 1776, kind of the debate that went back on should we declare our independence. Some of those discussions that are fairly well documented, I think, would be really interesting to see, and you really could have some fun with it in the Twitter vernacular by Ben Franklin or John Adams having these arguments back and forth on Twitter, replying or typing in at Ben Franklin, and I think it could be you could really have some fun with it.
And just to pick up on, oh sorry,
go ahead. No, go ahead. That's yours.
Yeah, just to pick up on something that Larry just mentioned. I mean, I think that the idea of, for example, examining and maybe appreciating opposing perspectives in global conflicts is something that I think is particularly interesting here. And we actually have there is some international interest in this idea of using a pseudo reenactment, and not so much a reenactment because you can actually carry it forward as well as looking at the past. So, but the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a good example. We've actually also had some interest from a university in Switzerland, as well as a teacher in Germany, who have we've kind of gotten together. He actually, with his class, reenacted using blogs as well as Twitter, which I saw something in the chat about using blogs to do the same type of thing, and he did that. He was able to reenact the failed attempt at unification of Germany, which in 1848, I believe, which was a very pivotal event for Europe. So so I think these things extend across boundaries and can be used for different kinds of perspective taking, where people have opposing views and perhaps can use this to take a step back and look at the other side's perspective.
Lisa just asked a question that the pre-planning, does that prevent spontaneous in-character responses? And we do pre-plan, but some of that spontaneity can come together when JFK sits down with Robert McNamara, and maybe they read through what Robert McNamara tweeted, and they say, oh, I had this, I've got this in my thing, so we're going to make sure that comes right after. So some of that spontaneity can be realized right there, and then of course when it's presented, when it's played to the person following, it just looks like there's kind of that one-on-one exchange or things like that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but some of that spontaneity can come as they're planning it, and to them it's spontaneous, even though that spontaneity won't be shown until it's actually put in and presented.
And it would seem like, I mean, the idea is that students are studying these characters, and and by doing all the research and following, maybe the pre-polling lines. But I would think they'd be encouraged to do the spontaneity in character form.
Yeah. We had some great exchanges between, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was kind of the hawks and the doves in the group that JFK had pulled together. And, you could clearly tell this was being written by students in the 21st century, but it was kind of fun to see that play back and forth. Another question that was just asked is, how do you break down the complex writing of early eras into 140 characters? We've kind of made a point, especially in the Pioneer track, there was a lot of misspellings, and even words that we had to go and look up because they used it differently. We keep all of that in just because we think that it adds to the flavor. But one of the most painful things was to sit down with a text from Abraham Lincoln and try to squeeze that into a tweet. Talk about painful, and you almost feel sacrilegious because here you are taking these wonderful words that Abraham Lincoln's written, taking 2 or 3 paragraphs and trying to boil that down to 140 characters. There were some really hard decisions. But part of that goes back to what does a historian do? They look through these original documents and decides what are the key points, what do I need to bring forth, and that's exactly what the students have to do as they're preparing these tweets. And
just to piggyback on that, I think one of the things that Sam Weinberg has brought out in some of his research at Stanford is this idea of rethinking history teaching and even historical thinking. And we're a lot of times we use standardized tests to decide how much history knowledge our students really have attained. And I think that Sam Weinberg's research challenges that assumption, and I think that part of what we're trying to do is come at history and historical thinking with a different angle. And this is not about memorizing the dates or how many steps there are in the Parthenon or any of that. This is really about trying to really understand the minds of those who were involved in these historical events, and I think one way to do that is to try to, as closely as possible, represent them in a creative endeavor like a reenactment. And there really is a lot of creativity to it, and it seems to take students out of the position of just information receivers and the one-way kinds of teaching where they really are just almost watching TV, and it changes them into producers of information, puts them in the position of almost like the textbook writer, where they make those hard decisions about what to represent and what to leave out. And it really gives them a reason to dive deep into the sources, and I think it gives them a much more full perspective, rather than just kind of the 60,000 feet perspective that most textbooks are forced to take.
And that was for me when I was doing the Battle of Chancellorsville. I was living in Logan, Utah at the time, and Logan, Utah often has similar temperatures to many places up in Alaska. It's the coldest place in Utah. And I'm not a cold person. I like 90-degree temperatures. So we just got through this horrible winter, and it's April, and all of these tweets just before the Battle of Chancellorsville were, a lot of them were just how beautiful the weather was, and we got out and we were playing some games. And so for me, in my mind, the Battle of Chancellorsville, I don't know the exact dates, but it's always going to be tied to spring, because I experienced that spring with these soldiers. The comments that they had were some of the same experiences that I was feeling. So it's one more little tie that, if we relive the Cuban Missile Crisis and we just happen to remember that all the trees are falling, even though we don't know the exact dates, it's kind of a way to tie history to our own lives and really get a feel for it.
Right, and just to add one more example that really was very poignant to me, I was following the Twitter, the reenactment for the Battle of Gettysburg, following some of the characters, and really got very interested in a particular character who was tweeting a lot about his wife and just how much he loved his wife and over and over again. And a lot of this was from letters that he actually sent back to his wife. Well, then at one point the character just completely disappears, and then it's not until we find out later that he's been killed, and you've really kind of created a relationship with that character as you followed that character. At least I did, and it was it really gave me a new perspective on war and conflict, and in particular the Battle of Gettysburg. That particular soldier who had tweeted about his wife and his young child really was very poignant.
All right. Well, I really want to thank you, Tom and Marion, for bringing us a great discussion here. I think we all are really excited about this model and eager to see where it goes from here. And I wouldn't be surprised if some people in this audience maybe even think of some new angles on it. So thanks again for providing a great closing session to the NMC Symposium on New Media and Learning. This was a great crowning touch.
Thanks for letting us come and present.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, and now I'm going to invite Larry Johnson to come out, who's going to do kind of a closing recap message for today.